Catherine Morris stood in line at Gate 47 of Dallas International Airport, with her boarding pass clutched in her hand. The morning sun streamed through the massive windows and she could see planes taking off in the distance. She had flown this exact route more times than she could count, but today something felt different. Her husband Daniel had booked her ticket last night, while she was at the hospital with her mother who had suffered a minor heart attack. Everything had happened so fast that she hadn't even checked which class she was flying. Now as she approached the gate, she realized she was holding an economy ticket. The gate agent was a woman in her mid-40s named Patricia Green. She had dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and wore the airline uniform with an air of authority that seemed exaggerated for her position. Patricia looked at Catherine with eyes that seemed to assess and judge in a single glance. Catherine noticed the way Patricia's lips pressed together in a thin line when she saw the economy ticket. Catherine smiled politely and said she usually flew first class and wondered if there might be any available upgrades. She was willing to pay whatever the difference might be. She explained that her husband had booked the ticket in a rush due to a family emergency, and she hadn't had time to check the details. Patricia looked at her with an expression that could only be described as contempt. She glanced at Catherine's simple jeans and comfortable sweater and seemed to make a decision about who Catherine was and what she deserved. The gate agent's voice was cold when she spoke, and every word dripped with condescension. She said that upgrades were not simply handed out to anyone who walked up and asked for them. She suggested that perhaps Catherine should have planned her travel arrangements better. She added that the first-class cabin was reserved for their premium customers, and that Catherine would need to board with the other economy passengers. Catherine felt her face grow warm with embarrassment. Other passengers in line behind her were starting to stare, and she could hear whispers. She tried once more to explain politely that she was a frequent flyer and had always had positive experiences with the airline. She showed Patricia her frequent flyer number, hoping that might make a difference. Patricia barely glanced at the number. She called over two other gate agents who seemed to be her friends. One was a man named Peter Collins who had graying hair and a permanent smirk on his face. The other was a woman named Linda Shaw, who looked like she enjoyed watching other people squirm. The three of them exchanged knowing glances, and Patricia made a comment loud enough for others to hear about how some people think they can just demand special treatment. Peter chimed in with a laugh, saying that economy class was perfectly comfortable for most people. Linda added that maybe Catherine should consider budgeting better for her flights if she wanted to sit in first class. The three of them seemed to feed off each other's cruelty, and Catherine realized that complaining further would only make the situation worse. She quietly stepped out of line and moved to the economy boarding area. Her hands were shaking slightly and she felt tears threatening to form, but she refused to let them fall. She had dealt with difficult people before in her life, but there was something particularly cruel about being humiliated in public by people who seemed to enjoy their small amount of power. As she waited for her boarding group to be called, she noticed that Patricia and her colleagues kept glancing in her direction and laughing. They seemed to think the entire situation was highly amusing. Other passengers who had witnessed the exchange looked at Catherine with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they had not been the target of such treatment. Catherine pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to Daniel. She didn't want to worry him, but she needed to share what had happened. She typed out a brief description of the incident, trying to keep her tone light and even adding a small joke about how she would survive the flight in economy. She knew Daniel was in back-to-back meetings all day and probably wouldn't see the message for hours. What Catherine didn't mention in her text was how deeply the incident had affected her. She had always believed in treating everyone with respect, regardless of their job or status. She dressed modestly not because she couldn't afford expensive clothes, but because she didn't believe in showing off. She drove a regular car and lived in a nice but not ostentatious house. She volunteered at the local community center and donated generously to charities without ever seeking recognition. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. Here she was being judged and found wanting by people who had no idea who she was. They had looked at her appearance and made assumptions. They had wielded their tiny bit of authority like a weapon, and she had been powerless to defend herself. Without making a scene, when her boarding group was finally called, Catherine walked onto the plane with her head held high. She found her seat in economy class and settled in for the flight. The seat was cramped and the legroom was minimal, but she had experienced far worse things in her life. A family emergency and her mother's health were infinitely more important than airline seating. As the plane took off, Catherine looked out the window at the clouds below. She thought about the gate agents and wondered what kind of lives they led that made them treat others so poorly. She felt sorry for them in a way because people who derive pleasure from humiliating others are usually deeply unhappy themselves. She didn't know it yet, but her simple text to Daniel had set something in motion. Her husband had glanced at his phone between meetings and read her message. While Catherine saw it as a minor inconvenience, Daniel saw it as something else entirely. He saw his wife being treated with disrespect, and he was not the kind of man who let such things slide. Catherine had always been the kindest person he knew, and the thought of someone treating her cruelly made his jaw tighten with anger. But Daniel Morris was not a man who acted rashly. He had built a billion-dollar company through careful planning and strategic thinking. He would handle this situation the same way he handled everything else in his life, with precision and purpose. The gate agents had no idea what they had started. Daniel Morris sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Morris Aerospace Technologies building. The view stretched across the city skyline, but he wasn't looking at it. His eyes were fixed on his phone screen, reading Catherine's text message for the third time. Most people who knew Daniel would describe him as calm and measured in all situations. He had faced corporate takeovers and hostile competitors without losing his composure. But this was different because this involved his wife. Catherine was the one person in his life who kept him grounded. When he had started his company 15 years ago in a small garage, she had believed in him. When investors had laughed at his ideas, she had encouraged him to keep going. When he had worked 18-hour days for months on end, she had brought him meals and reminded him to sleep. She had been his partner in every sense of the word, and she had never asked for anything in return. Now someone had humiliated her, and Daniel felt a cold anger settling in his chest. He looked at his watch and saw that he had 20 minutes before his next meeting. He pressed the intercom button on his desk and asked his assistant to get Gregory Palmer on the line immediately. Gregory Palmer had been with Daniel for 8 years. Before joining Morris Aerospace Technologies, Gregory had spent 15 years in military intelligence. He was the kind of man who could find information that most people didn't even know existed. When Gregory answered the phone, Daniel got straight to the point. He explained what had happened to Catherine and asked Gregory to find out everything he could about the incident and the people involved. Gregory didn't ask questions. He simply said he would have a full report within 6 hours. Daniel thanked him and ended the call. He sat back in his chair and thought about how to handle the situation. He could call the airline directly and complain, but that would likely result in a standard apology and nothing more. He could use his influence to make life difficult for the gate agents, but that seemed petty. What he really wanted was to understand why this had happened and whether it was part of a larger problem. Daniel had not built his fortune by being ruthless or cruel. He had built it by identifying problems and creating solutions. His company had revolutionized satellite communications by making it faster and more affordable. They had developed technology that allowed people in remote areas to access the internet. They had created systems that helped scientists track climate change and predict natural disasters. Everything he did was about making the world better in some small way, but he also believed in accountability. When his employees made mistakes, they faced consequences. When his company failed to meet standards, they worked to improve. He expected the same from everyone he did business with. If the airline had a culture that allowed employees to treat customers this way, then that was a problem that needed to be addressed. His phone buzzed with a message from Catherine saying she had landed safely. She added that she was feeling better and was sorry for complaining about something so trivial. Daniel smiled at that because it was so typical of her to minimize her own feelings. He texted back telling her he loved her and asking how her mother was doing. She replied that her mother was stable and resting comfortably. Daniel went to his next meeting, but his mind was only half focused on the quarterly projections being presented. He kept thinking about Catherine standing in that airport being treated like she didn't matter. He thought about all the other people who probably experienced similar treatment every day. Most of them didn't have the resources or connections to do anything about it. They just had to accept it and move on. The meeting ended and Daniel returned to his office to find an encrypted email from Gregory waiting for him. He opened it and began reading. What he found was disturbing. Gregory had obtained security footage from the airport showing the entire incident. Daniel watched as Patricia Green spoke to Catherine with obvious disdain. He saw Peter Collins and Linda Shaw join in to mock his wife. He saw Catherine's face as she tried to maintain her dignity while being publicly humiliated. But the video was just the beginning. Gregory had also pulled complaint records for all 3 gate agents. Patricia Green had 17 formal complaints filed against her in the past year. The complaints ranged from rudeness to outright discrimination. Peter Collins had been warned multiple times for making inappropriate comments to female passengers. Linda Shaw had denied boarding to several passengers over minor technicalities that other agents would have overlooked. The most troubling part was that the airline had done nothing about any of it. The complaints had been filed and then seemingly forgotten. There were notes in the system about verbal warnings but no actual consequences. The 3 gate agents had learned that they could treat passengers however they wanted without fear of losing their jobs. Gregory's report went deeper. He had discovered that the culture at Dallas International Airport was toxic from top to bottom. The operations manager was a woman named Helen Price, who had been with the airline for over 20 years. She protected her staff no matter what they did, as long as they remained loyal to her. Employees who complained about the work environment were transferred or pushed out. Customer complaints were dismissed as exaggerations or lies. Daniel read through page after page of documented incidents. Passengers being yelled at for asking questions, families being separated because of rigid rule enforcement, elderly travelers being denied assistance, disabled passengers being treated with impatience. The pattern was clear and it was sickening. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer. He explained the situation and asked what legal options might be available. The lawyer listened carefully and then said that while Catherine could file a complaint with the airline, or even pursue legal action, the process would be long and the outcome uncertain. Airlines had teams of lawyers and standard procedures for dealing with such situations. Most of the time they would offer some kind of settlement or compensation to make the problem go away. Daniel thanked his lawyer and ended the call. He didn't want a settlement or compensation. He wanted real change. He sat at his desk thinking about the best approach. Then he remembered something. His company had several contracts with Skyway Airlines. They provided the satellite internet systems for all of Skyway's planes. They had developed the entertainment platform that passengers used during flights. The contracts were worth over $200 million annually, but there was something even bigger in the works. For the past 6 months, Daniel had been in quiet negotiations to purchase a major stake in Skyway Airlines. The deal was nearly complete and would make him one of the largest shareholders in the company. He had been excited about the opportunity to bring innovation and improved customer experience to the airline industry. Now he wondered if that partnership was such a good idea after all. Daniel spent the next 2 days gathering information and thinking through his options. He asked Gregory to expand the investigation beyond just the 3 gate agents and Dallas International Airport. He wanted to know if this was an isolated problem or something systemic throughout Skyway Airlines. Gregory assembled a small team and went to work pulling data from public records and sources within the industry. The results were mixed. Some Skyway locations had excellent customer service ratings and well-trained staff who genuinely seemed to care about passengers. Other locations had patterns of complaints similar to what they had found in Dallas. The common thread was management. Where airports had strong ethical leadership, the employees performed well. Where management was weak or corrupt, the culture deteriorated rapidly. Dallas International stood out as particularly problematic. Helen Price had created what could only be described as a fiefdom. She hired people who were loyal to her personally, rather than people who were good at their jobs. She promoted based on favoritism rather than merit. She ignored complaints from both passengers and her own staff members who tried to speak up about problems. Over the years, she had built a protective wall around herself using connections within the corporate structure. Daniel learned that Helen was friendly with several executives at Skyway's headquarters. She had been with the company since its early days and knew where bodies were buried, so to speak. People were afraid to challenge her because she had ended careers before. Employees who crossed her found themselves transferred to undesirable locations or simply fired for minor infractions. It was a classic case of someone abusing power because they had been allowed to get away with it for too long. Gregory discovered something else interesting. 3 years ago, a group of gate agents at Dallas International had filed a formal complaint with corporate headquarters about the hostile work environment. They had documented incidents of favoritism and mistreatment. They had provided examples of how customer complaints were being ignored. The complaint had gone nowhere. Within 6 months, all of the agents who had signed it were no longer working for the airline. Some had been fired for alleged performance issues. Others had quit after being made miserable by Helen and her inner circle. Daniel read through the old complaint and felt his anger growing. This was not just about Catherine anymore. This was about a pattern of abuse that had been allowed to continue for years. Good employees had been driven out. Passengers had been mistreated. And the airline's leadership had either been unaware or had chosen to look the other way. He decided it was time to make a call. He looked up the direct number for Charles Bennett, who was the CEO of Skyway Airlines. Charles and Daniel had spoken many times over the past months as they negotiated the investment deal. They had developed what Daniel thought was a good working relationship. Charles seemed like a decent man who genuinely cared about his company. Daniel hoped that was true because he was about to put that to the test. He picked up his phone and dialed the number. Charles answered on the second ring, sounding cheerful and friendly. He asked Daniel if he was calling about finalizing the contract details. They were scheduled to sign the papers the following week, and Charles was clearly excited about the partnership. Daniel took a breath and said they needed to talk about something else first. His tone was serious enough that Charles immediately shifted gears. He asked what was wrong, and Daniel began explaining. He described what had happened to Catherine at Dallas International. He detailed the findings from Gregory's investigation. He talked about the pattern of complaints and the toxic culture that had been allowed to develop. Charles was quiet for a long moment after Daniel finished speaking. Then he said he was deeply sorry about what had happened to Catherine and that it was completely unacceptable. He said he would look into the matter immediately and promised that appropriate action would be taken. He assured Daniel that this was not representative of Skyway's values or standards. Daniel appreciated the words, but he needed more than promises. He asked Charles if he was aware of the complaints against Patricia Green and the other gate agents. He asked if Charles knew about Helen Price's management style. He asked if the CEO had any idea what was really happening at some of his airports. Charles admitted that he did not have that level of detailed knowledge about every location. Skyway operated hundreds of airports and employed thousands of people. He relied on regional managers and operations directors to handle day-to-day issues. He said that if what Daniel was telling him was true, then there had been serious failures in the oversight system. Daniel said he could provide documentation of everything he had found. He offered to share the security footage and the complaint records. He suggested that Charles might want to conduct his own independent investigation before they went any further with their business relationship. He made it clear that he could not, in good conscience, invest in a company that allowed this kind of behavior to continue. Charles seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He said he would personally oversee an investigation and would get back to Daniel within a week. He thanked Daniel for bringing the matter to his attention, rather than simply walking away from the deal or taking the issue public. After the call ended, Daniel sat back in his chair feeling somewhat relieved. He had given Charles a chance to do the right thing. Now he would wait and see what happened. If the airline took meaningful action to address the problems, then perhaps the partnership could move forward. If they tried to sweep it under the rug or offered only token responses, then Daniel would walk away and take his business elsewhere. Catherine came home that evening and found Daniel in his study staring at his computer screen. She asked what he was working on, and he told her he had been looking into what happened at the airport. She immediately looked concerned and said she hoped he wasn't making too big a deal out of it. She said it was just a bad experience and she had already moved past it. Daniel turned to look at his wife. She was wearing old jeans and one of his sweatshirts with her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked beautiful to him and also impossibly kind. He realized that she genuinely didn't want anyone to get in trouble because of her. That was just who she was. But he also knew that letting this kind of behavior go unchallenged only allowed it to continue. He explained to Catherine that this wasn't just about her experience. He told her what Gregory had found about the other complaints and the pattern of mistreatment. He described the employees who had been pushed out for trying to speak up. He talked about all the other passengers who had probably suffered similar or worse treatment. Catherine listened and slowly nodded. She understood what he was saying. She asked what he planned to do, and he said he had given the airline CEO a chance to investigate and take action. She asked what would happen if they didn't do enough. and Daniel said honestly that he would probably walk away. From the investment deal, Catherine put her hand on his shoulder and said she supported whatever decision he made. She knew that Daniel's business choices were always guided by his principles. It was one of the things she loved most about him. He had never compromised his values for profit, and she knew he never would. Charles Bennett sat in his executive office staring at the report spread across his desk. It had been 3 days since his call with Daniel Morris, and what he had discovered during his investigation kept him awake at night. He had ordered his head of human resources and his chief operations officer to conduct a thorough review of Dallas International Airport. He had also hired an independent consulting firm to examine the complaint system across the entire airline. The findings were worse than he had imagined. Dallas International was a disaster, but it was not alone. The investigation had uncovered similar problems at 6 other major airports in the Skyway network. Complaint systems that were supposed to flag serious issues had been ignored or circumvented. Managers who protected bad employees while driving out good ones. A culture in some locations where power was abused and customers were treated with contempt. Charles had been CEO of Skyway Airlines for 4 years. He had come into the position with big ideas about modernizing the fleet and improving customer experience. He had invested heavily in new planes and upgraded technology. He had launched marketing campaigns promoting Skyway as the friendly airline that cared about its passengers. But apparently, while he had been focused on the big picture, serious problems had been festering at the operational level. Helen Price's file was particularly disturbing. She had started with the company 23 years ago as a gate agent and had worked her way up to operations manager at one of their busiest airports. Her performance reviews were glowing, but Charles now understood that was because she had cultivated relationships with the people who wrote those reviews. She was skilled at managing up while being terrible at managing down. The complaint that had been filed 3 years ago by the group of gate agents should have triggered a major investigation. Instead, it had been handled quietly by regional management who were friends with Helen. The complaining employees had been labeled as troublemakers and systematically removed. Charles felt sick reading about how the system had failed so completely. He looked at the security footage that Daniel had provided showing the incident with Catherine Morris. Watching it made him angry and embarrassed. This was happening in his airline under his leadership. These employees wore uniforms with the Skyway logo while treating a customer like garbage. Patricia Green's smirk as she humiliated Catherine was infuriating. The way Peter Collins and Linda Shaw had joined in made it clear this was not an isolated moment of bad judgment, but rather their standard operating procedure. Charles picked up his phone and called his head of human resources. He said they needed to prepare termination papers for Helen Price and her inner circle at Dallas International. The HR director hesitated and said that firing Helen could be complicated because of her tenure and her connections. Charles said he didn't care about complications. What had happened was unacceptable, and there would be accountability. The HR director mentioned that Helen might sue for wrongful termination. Charles said they had more than enough documentation to justify the decision. They had complaint records. They had security footage. They had testimony from former employees. If Helen wanted to take them to court, she was welcome to try, but he doubted she would want all of this made public. Next, Charles called his operations chief and told him to start identifying replacement management for Dallas International. They needed people with strong ethical backgrounds and proven track records of good leadership. He didn't care if they had to recruit from outside the company. This was an opportunity to reset the culture, and he wanted it done right. Then Charles did something he rarely did. He cleared his entire schedule for the next week. He told his assistant to book him on a flight to Dallas because he was going to handle this situation personally. His executive team was surprised because Charles usually delegated operational issues to his regional managers. But this was different. This was a test of what kind of company Skyway Airlines really was. Before leaving for Dallas, Charles called Daniel Morris. He explained everything he had found during the investigation. He acknowledged that the problems were more widespread than just one airport. He detailed the actions he was taking, including the immediate termination of Helen Price and the gate agents involved in the incident with Catherine. Daniel listened carefully. He appreciated that Charles was taking the matter seriously, but he had questions. He asked what would be done to prevent this from happening again. He asked how the airline would change its complaint system. He asked what kind of training would be implemented to ensure employees understood what was expected of them. Charles admitted he didn't have all the answers yet, but he was committed to finding them. He said he was flying to Dallas personally to oversee the transition. He promised to implement new oversight mechanisms and training programs. He said he would make sure that every employee understood that treating customers with respect was not optional. Daniel asked what would happen to the other airports where similar problems had been identified. Charles said each location would be reviewed and changes would be made where necessary. He acknowledged this was going to be a major undertaking, but it was necessary. He said Daniel had actually done him a favor by bringing this to his attention, before it became an even bigger problem. Daniel appreciated Charles's response, but he still had concerns. He said that firing a few people and implementing new policies was a good start, but culture change required sustained effort. He asked if Charles was truly prepared to follow through even when it became difficult or expensive. Charles said he understood the skepticism. He admitted that Skyway had lost its way in some respects. They had become so focused on efficiency and cost-cutting that they had forgotten the basics of customer service. He said this was a wake-up call, and he intended to use it to make fundamental changes. The two men talked for over an hour, discussing what a better airline culture might look like. Daniel shared some of the principles that had guided his own company. He talked about how treating employees well generally resulted in them treating customers well. He discussed the importance of accountability at all levels. He emphasized that leadership had to model the behavior they expected from everyone else. Charles found himself taking notes. He realized that Daniel was offering him valuable insights not just about this specific situation, but about building a better organization. He said he hoped that despite everything that had happened, they could still move forward with their partnership. He believed Daniel's perspective and expertise could help transform Skyway into the kind of airline it should be. Daniel said he would reserve judgment until he saw concrete actions. He appreciated the conversation and Charles's apparent commitment to change. But he had learned over the years that what people did mattered more than what they said. He would be watching to see if the changes were real and lasting. After the call ended, Charles sat quietly for a moment. He felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had thousands of employees and millions of passengers depending on him to run the airline properly. He had been so focused on financial performance and market share that he had missed what was happening on the ground. That was going to change starting now. Charles Bennett arrived at Dallas International Airport on a Tuesday morning, without any advance notice to the local staff. He wanted to see the operation as it really was, not as it would be presented if they knew the CEO was coming. He wore casual clothes instead of a suit and walked through the terminal observing everything. What he saw troubled him. Gate agents stood around chatting with each other while passengers waited in confusion. Signs were poorly placed and confusing. The customer service desk had a long line but only one person working despite 3 empty stations. Staff members seemed more interested in their phones than in helping travelers. The whole atmosphere felt impersonal and uncaring. Charles made his way to the operations office where Helen Price had her domain. He showed his identification to the receptionist, who looked shocked to see the CEO standing in front of her. She stammered something about letting Helen know he was there, but Charles said that wouldn't be necessary. He walked past her desk and opened the door to Helen's office. Helen Price was sitting at her desk eating lunch and talking on her personal phone. She looked up in surprise when Charles entered. She quickly ended her call and stood up, trying to compose herself. She started to say something about what an honor it was, but Charles cut her off. He told her to sit down because they needed to have a conversation. Helen sat looking nervous now. Charles pulled out a folder containing printed copies of complaint records and the security footage from Catherine's incident. He placed them on the desk in front of Helen and asked if she was aware of these issues. Helen glanced at the papers and tried to deflect. She said that passenger complaints were common in the airline industry, and that sometimes people just wanted to cause trouble. She said her team did their best, but you couldn't please everyone. She suggested that maybe Charles didn't understand the challenges of managing an airport operation. Charles felt his anger rising, but he kept his voice calm. He asked Helen directly if she thought it was acceptable for her gate agents to mock and humiliate passengers. He asked if she believed that 17 complaints against a single employee should be ignored. He asked why she had punished the agents who had tried to report problems 3 years ago. Helen's face went pale. She realized that Charles knew far more than she had assumed. She tried to explain that those complaining agents had been troublemakers who didn't understand how things worked. She said she had to maintain discipline and loyalty among her staff. She suggested that if Charles had to manage difficult employees every day, he would understand her choices. Charles stood up and told Helen that her employment with Skyway Airlines was terminated effective immediately. He said security would escort her from the building, and that she would receive information about her final paycheck and benefits. He made it clear that if she tried to cause problems or retaliate against anyone, he would ensure that every detail of her management failures became public record. Helen started to argue, but Charles was already walking out of her office. He found the head of security and instructed him to escort Helen from the premises. Then he called an emergency meeting of all Dallas International Airport staff for later that afternoon. News of Helen's firing spread through the airport within minutes. Employees gathered in small groups whispering and speculating. Some looked worried because they had been part of Helen's inner circle. Others looked relieved because they had been suffering under her management. Charles spent the next few hours meeting with various department heads and reviewing operations. At 3 o'clock, the entire staff assembled in a conference room that was normally used for training. There weren't enough chairs, so many people stood along the walls. Charles walked to the front of the room and looked at the faces staring back at him. Some looked defiant. Some looked scared. A few looked hopeful. Charles introduced himself, though most already knew who he was. He said he was there because serious problems had come to his attention. He explained that Skyway Airlines was built on the principle of providing excellent service to customers. But that principle had been forgotten at this location. He said the culture that had developed here was unacceptable, and it was going to change starting today. He told them about Helen's termination. He announced that Patricia Green, Peter Collins, and Linda Shaw were also being let go. He said that anyone else who had been involved in mistreating customers or employees should expect to face consequences. He made it clear that the old way of doing things was over, but Charles also said that he understood many employees were good people who had been working in a bad system. He said he was not there to punish everyone, but rather to create a fresh start. He announced that new management would be brought in, and that everyone would receive updated training on customer service and professional conduct. He said those who were willing to embrace the new culture would have opportunities to grow and succeed. One of the older gate agents raised her hand and asked what would happen if they encountered difficult passengers. Charles said dealing with challenges was part of the job, but there was a difference between enforcing policies professionally and abusing power. He said he expected employees to treat every passenger with respect, even when situations were frustrating. Another employee asked if they would be protected if they reported problems with management in the future. Charles acknowledged that the system had failed whistleblowers in the past. He said he was implementing new reporting procedures that would go directly to corporate headquarters. He promised that retaliation against anyone who reported legitimate concerns would result in immediate termination of the person doing the retaliating. The meeting lasted over an hour. Charles took questions and listened to concerns. He could see that some employees were skeptical because they had heard promises before, but he could also see that others were genuinely excited about the possibility of positive change. He ended the meeting by saying his door was open and that he would be staying in Dallas for the rest of the week to oversee the transition. After the staff meeting, Charles met with the independent consulting firm he had hired. They presented their findings about the complaint system across the entire airline. The problems were systemic. Complaints were logged but rarely investigated thoroughly. There was no real accountability for managers who ignored issues. The people responsible for oversight had become too comfortable and complacent. Charles authorized a complete overhaul of the system. Every complaint would now be reviewed by an independent team. Serious issues would trigger automatic investigations. Managers would be evaluated partly on how they handled problems, rather than on how well they hid them. It would be expensive and time-consuming, but it was necessary. He also ordered a review of hiring and promotion practices. Too many people had been promoted based on loyalty rather than competence. Going forward, there would be clear criteria for advancement, and those criteria would emphasize leadership skills and ethical behavior. He wanted to attract and retain people who genuinely cared about serving customers well. That evening, Charles called Daniel Morris to update him on the day's events. He described firing Helen and the others. He talked about the staff meeting and the changes being implemented. He acknowledged that fixing everything would take time, but said he was committed to seeing it through. Daniel listened and said he appreciated the quick action. He asked how the remaining employees had responded, and Charles said it was mixed but generally more positive than he had expected. Many people seemed relieved that the toxic leadership was gone. Daniel said that was a good sign, and suggested Charles focus on empowering those good employees to help rebuild the culture. Daniel Morris sat across from Charles Bennett in a private conference room at Skyway Airlines headquarters. It had been 2 weeks since the firings at Dallas International, and Charles had requested this meeting to discuss the future of their business relationship. The investment deal was still on the table, but both men knew it could not move forward without addressing what had happened. Charles began by thanking Daniel for forcing him to confront problems he should have been aware of already. He presented a detailed plan for cultural reform across the entire airline. New training programs were being developed. The complaint system was being rebuilt from scratch. Regional managers were being evaluated, and several had already been replaced. He said these changes would cost tens of millions of dollars but were essential for the company's future. Daniel reviewed the documents carefully. The plan was comprehensive and seemed well thought out, but he had concerns about implementation. He asked Charles how he would ensure these changes actually happened and were not just words on paper. He pointed out that many companies create impressive reform plans that never get executed properly. Charles acknowledged the concern. He said he was creating a new position of Vice President for Customer Experience who would report directly to him. This person would have authority to override operational decisions that conflicted with customer service principles. He was also implementing quarterly reviews of every airport location, with public scorecards showing customer satisfaction and complaint resolution rates. Daniel asked what would happen if the changes didn't work or if the culture reverted to old patterns. Charles said honestly that it was a risk, but he was personally committed to preventing backsliding. He said he would be visiting airports regularly without advance notice to see real operations. He would be reading customer complaints himself, instead of relying on summaries from others. The conversation shifted to the investment deal. Charles said he hoped Daniel would still be willing to move forward. He argued that Morris Aerospace Technologies' involvement could actually accelerate the cultural transformation. Daniel's reputation for ethical business practices would send a strong signal to employees and customers alike. His technological innovations could improve the passenger experience in meaningful ways. Daniel sat back in his chair considering. He had built his company on certain principles, and partnering with Skyway would mean associating his name with their brand. If they failed to follow through on their promises, it would reflect poorly on him as well. But if they succeeded in creating real change, it could be a powerful example for other companies. He told Charles that he was willing to move forward, but with conditions. First, there would be a probationary period of 6 months during which he would monitor the implementation of the reforms. If progress was not being made, he could walk away from the deal without penalty. Second, he wanted quarterly meetings where Charles would present data on customer satisfaction and employee engagement. Third, he wanted the right to conduct independent audits of any Skyway location at any time. Charles agreed to all the conditions without hesitation. He said he welcomed the accountability because it would help keep everyone focused. He suggested they formalize these terms in the investment contract so there would be no ambiguity later. The lawyers were brought in and spent the next several hours drafting amendments to the agreement. Daniel insisted on specific measurable goals that Skyway needed to achieve during the probationary period. Customer complaint resolution rates had to improve by at least 30%. Employee satisfaction scores had to show positive trends. Training completion rates had to reach 95% across all locations. If Skyway failed to meet these benchmarks, Daniel could either withdraw his investment or reduce the amount significantly. Charles accepted these terms because he was confident they could achieve the goals. He believed the changes they were making would produce results that exceeded even Daniel's expectations. As the sun set outside the conference room windows, the final contract was completed. Both men reviewed it one more time before signing. This was not just a business deal anymore. It had become a partnership focused on proving that a large company could change its culture and truly put customers First, Daniel shook Charles' hand and said he looked forward to seeing what they could accomplish together. Charles said he was grateful for the second chance and would not waste it. He knew that many CEOs in his position would have resented Daniel for causing so much disruption, but he recognized that Daniel had actually helped him identify and address serious problems before they caused even greater damage. The next day, the investment deal was announced publicly. The press release emphasized the technological innovations that Morris Aerospace would bring to Skyway Airlines. It mentioned plans to upgrade in-flight entertainment systems and expand satellite internet coverage. It talked about improving operational efficiency and customer experience. What the press release did not mention were the specific reasons behind the timing or the unusual contractual conditions. Most business reporters saw it as a straightforward tech partnership. A few industry insiders who knew about the Dallas International situation understood there was more to the story, but details remained private. Catherine read the announcement at home and smiled. She knew Daniel had wrestled with the decision, but she was proud that he had chosen a path focused on creating positive change. She had never wanted anyone to lose their jobs because of what happened to her, but she understood that some people had lost their jobs because of their own actions over many years. She called Daniel at his office to congratulate him. He thanked her and said none of it would have happened if she hadn't told him about the incident. She laughed and said she supposed some good had come from a bad situation. He said more good was coming because Charles seemed genuinely committed to reform. That evening, Daniel received a call from Gregory Palmer. His security chief had been monitoring the situation at Dallas International and other Skyway locations. Gregory reported that the changes seemed to be real. New managers had been brought in and were implementing training programs. Employees who had been afraid to speak up before were starting to report problems. The culture was shifting, though it would take time to fully transform. Gregory also mentioned something interesting. Several employees from other airlines had reached out asking if Skyway was hiring. Word had spread in the industry about the reforms, and people who cared about customer service wanted to work somewhere that valued those principles. Charles was being selective about who to hire, but the quality of applicants had improved dramatically. Daniel was encouraged by this news. It suggested that the market was responding positively to what Skyway was doing. If other airlines saw them succeeding with a customer-first culture, they might be pressured to make similar changes. That kind of industry-wide impact was exactly what Daniel hoped for. He thought about Catherine's experience at the airport and how it had set all of this in motion. One moment of mistreatment had exposed systemic problems and created an opportunity for meaningful reform. He wondered how many other incidents like that happened every day without anyone being in a position to do anything about them. Probably thousands or millions. Daniel could not fix every problem in the world, but he could use his resources and influence to make a difference where possible. The Skyway partnership was just beginning, but he was optimistic about where it could lead. The changes at Dallas International Airport happened faster than anyone expected. Within a week of Helen Price's termination, a new operations manager named Lisa Hamilton arrived. She had been recruited from a smaller airline known for exceptional customer service. Lisa had a reputation for building strong teams and creating positive work environments. Charles had personally interviewed her and been impressed by her combination of operational expertise and genuine care for both employees and customers. Lisa's first action was to meet individually with every employee at the airport. She spent 2 full days doing nothing but listening to people talk about their experiences and concerns. She heard stories about the fear and frustration that had dominated the workplace under Helen's leadership. She also heard from employees who had ideas for improvement, but had never been allowed to share them. One gate agent named Karen Wright had worked at Dallas International for 12 years. She told Lisa about how she used to love her job but had grown to dread coming to work. She described watching good colleagues being driven out while bad behavior was rewarded. She talked about the stress of knowing that any day she might become a target if she said or did the wrong thing. Lisa listened to all of it without judgment. Then she asked Karen what would make the workplace better. Karen seemed surprised by the question because no manager had ever asked her opinion before. She thought for a moment and said that employees needed to feel safe reporting problems. They needed clear standards for how to treat customers. They needed managers who led by example instead of by intimidation. Lisa nodded and said those were exactly the things she intended to create. She asked if Karen would be willing to join a committee of employees who would help design new policies and procedures. Karen agreed enthusiastically. By the end of the 2 days, Lisa had recruited 8 employees from different departments to serve on this committee. They would meet weekly to discuss challenges and solutions. The committee's first recommendation was to create a passenger bill of rights that would be posted at every gate. It outlined what customers could expect from Skyway employees and what recourse they had if those expectations were not met. It was simple and clear. Every passenger deserved to be treated with respect. Every concern deserved to be heard. Every problem deserved a good faith effort at resolution. Lisa took the proposal to Charles, who approved it immediately. The Bill of Rights was printed on large placards and placed throughout the airport. Employees were required to read it and sign a document acknowledging they understood and agreed to uphold these standards. Anyone who violated these principles would face consequences ranging from retraining to termination, depending on the severity and frequency of violations. Training programs were completely overhauled. Instead of boring videos about corporate policies, the new training focused on real scenarios and role-playing exercises. Employees practiced dealing with frustrated passengers in difficult situations. They learned de-escalation techniques and problem-solving strategies. They were taught to see passengers as people rather than as problems. But Lisa also addressed employee concerns. She discovered that many customer service issues stemmed from staff feeling overworked and undervalued. Gate agents were expected to process passengers quickly, while also providing personalized service. When flights were delayed or canceled, agents bore the brunt of passenger anger even though they had no control over the situation. The stress was overwhelming and led to burnout. Lisa worked with Charles to address these issues. Additional staff were hired so that no one was constantly overwhelmed. Break schedules were improved. A quiet room was created where employees could decompress after dealing with particularly difficult situations. A recognition program was established to celebrate employees who went above and beyond in serving customers. The results were remarkable. Within a month, customer complaints at Dallas International dropped by 40%. Employee satisfaction surveys showed significant improvement. The atmosphere in the airport felt different. Passengers noticed that staff seemed friendlier and more helpful. Employees noticed that they enjoyed their work again, but not everyone was happy about the changes. Patricia Green had been fired along with Helen and several others. She believed she had done nothing wrong and that she was being made a scapegoat. She contacted a lawyer about suing Skyway for wrongful termination. Her lawyer reviewed the documentation, including the security footage of her interaction with Catherine and the 17 complaints against her. He advised Patricia that she had no case and pursuing legal action would likely make her look worse. Patricia tried reaching out to her contacts in the industry looking for a new job. She quickly discovered that word had spread about why she was fired. Other airlines were not interested in hiring someone with her track record. She had to accept a position at a rental car counter making far less money than she had earned before. She blamed Catherine and Daniel for ruining her career, never acknowledging her own role in what happened. Peter Collins and Linda Shaw faced similar difficulties. The airline industry was smaller than people realized and hiring managers talked to each other. Someone fired for mistreating customers was not an attractive candidate. Both eventually found jobs outside the airline industry, but at significant pay cuts. They too blamed others rather than accepting responsibility for their actions. Helen Price was in an even worse position. At 51 years old, with her management career in ruins, she struggled to find work. She had been making over $100,000 a year at Skyway. Now she was applying for positions paying half that and still getting rejected. Her connections in the industry could not help her because they knew that associating with her could damage their own reputations. She considered writing a tell-all book about Skyway Airlines, but her lawyer warned that would violate her severance agreement and could expose her to lawsuits. She thought about going to the media but realized that would only make her look worse. Eventually, she had to sell her house and move to a smaller apartment. The fall from power was complete. Meanwhile, the reforms spread beyond Dallas International. Charles was personally overseeing similar changes at the 6 other airports where problems had been identified. New managers were brought in. Toxic employees were removed. Training programs were implemented. The process was expensive and disruptive but necessary. Some regional managers resisted the changes. They argued that the old systems worked fine, and that Charles was overreacting to a few isolated incidents. Charles replaced those managers. He made it clear that this was not optional, and that anyone who could not embrace the new culture should find employment elsewhere. The transformation was not smooth or easy. There were setbacks and challenges. Some new hires did not work out. Some training programs needed to be revised. Some policies created unintended consequences that had to be addressed. But the overall trend was positive, and Charles remained committed. Daniel monitored the progress closely through his quarterly meetings with Charles and his independent audits. He was impressed by what he saw. The changes were real and measurable. Customer satisfaction scores were climbing. Employee retention was improving. The financial impact was mixed in the short term because of the costs involved, but Charles argued convincingly that it would pay off in the long run. At the end of the 6-month probationary period, Daniel decided to proceed with the full investment. Skyway had met all the benchmarks he had set and exceeded some of them. More importantly, the cultural shift felt genuine and sustainable. Charles had proven he was serious about reform and willing to make hard decisions. The partnership between Morris Aerospace Technologies and Skyway Airlines moved forward, with both companies benefiting. Daniel's technological innovations improved the passenger experience, while Charles's commitment to service excellence created a strong foundation for growth. 3 months after the full investment deal was finalized, Catherine Morris found herself back at Dallas International Airport. She was flying to Chicago for a charity event and had purchased a first-class ticket. As she approached Gate 47, she felt a momentary flutter of nervousness, remembering what had happened the last time she was here. But everything was different now. The gate area had been redesigned with more comfortable seating and better signage. The staff uniforms looked sharper, and the employees wearing them seemed genuinely happy to be there. Catherine noticed that the atmosphere felt welcoming rather than hostile. The gate agent was a young woman named Sophie Martin, who had been hired as part of the new wave of recruitment. Sophie greeted Catherine with a warm smile and checked her boarding pass efficiently. She asked if Catherine needed any assistance or had any special requests for the flight. Her tone was professional but also genuinely friendly. Catherine said she was fine and thanked Sophie for asking. As she moved toward the boarding area, she noticed Sophie greeting the next passenger with the same warmth and attention. It was not an act put on for certain customers. It was simply how Sophie treated everyone. Catherine settled into her first-class seat and thought about everything that had happened. She had never wanted to cause trouble or get anyone fired. She had simply wanted to be treated with basic respect. The fact that such a simple expectation had led to such dramatic changes still surprised her. She pulled out her phone and texted Daniel, telling him she was at the airport and that things seemed much better. He texted back saying he was glad and reminding her to enjoy her trip. He added that he loved her and was proud of how she handled everything. She smiled at the message, knowing that Daniel had done far more than she had, but appreciating the sentiment. The flight was smooth and pleasant. The cabin crew were attentive without being intrusive. Catherine noticed small improvements in the service that likely came from the new training programs. The flight attendants seemed empowered to solve problems, rather than just following rigid rules. When a passenger needed extra help with luggage, the crew member assisted cheerfully instead of pointing to a policy. When Catherine arrived in Chicago, she attended her charity event, which was raising money for a children's hospital. During the dinner, she found herself seated next to a woman named Gloria Peters, who worked as a consultant for various airlines. Gloria mentioned that she had recently been hired by Skyway to help with their cultural transformation project. Catherine asked how that was going, and Gloria's face lit up. She said it was one of the most rewarding projects she had ever worked on, because the leadership was genuinely committed to change. She talked about how rare it was to see a CEO personally involved in reform efforts the way Charles Bennett was. She said most executives delegated such work, but Charles attended training sessions and visited airports regularly. Gloria described the challenges they had faced. Changing organizational culture was never easy, especially in a large company. With thousands of employees across hundreds of locations, there was resistance and skepticism. Some people left because they could not adapt to the new expectations. But slowly and steadily, the culture was shifting. Catherine listened with interest but did not reveal her connection to the story. She simply asked what Gloria thought made the difference. Gloria said it came down to accountability and consistency. Rules had to apply to everyone. Managers had to model the behavior they expected. Employees had to see that speaking up about problems was safe and encouraged. She also mentioned something that stuck with Catherine. Gloria said the turning point had been when leadership fired some very senior people for misconduct. It sent a message that no one was untouchable and that the company was serious about change. That single action had done more to shift the culture than months of training programs. Catherine thought about Helen Price and the others who had been terminated. She still felt some sadness about it, but she understood that consequences were necessary. People who abused power and mistreated others could not be allowed to continue simply because they had seniority or connections. The next morning, Catherine flew back to Dallas. She deliberately chose Skyway Airlines for the return trip, wanting to see if the positive experience had been consistent. Once again, she was impressed. The service was excellent. The staff were professional and friendly. Small touches like a handwritten thank you note from the pilot to all passengers showed that attention to detail mattered. When she got home, she found Daniel in his study working on a presentation. She told him about her conversations with Gloria Peters and the overall experience flying Skyway. Daniel smiled and said Charles had mentioned that the consulting work was going well. He seemed pleased that Catherine had noticed the improvements. Catherine asked if Daniel thought the changes would last, or if the company would eventually slip back into old patterns. Daniel said that was always a risk, but he was optimistic. Charles had built accountability into the system. The quarterly reviews and public scorecards made it harder to hide problems. The investment agreement gave Daniel leverage to push for continued improvement. More importantly, the changes were starting to show up in Skyway's financial performance. Customer retention was improving. Positive word of mouth was bringing in new passengers. Employee productivity was higher because turnover was lower. The company was proving that treating people well was not just the right thing to do, but also good business. Daniel showed Catherine some data from the latest quarterly report. Customer satisfaction scores had increased by 47% across the locations that had implemented reforms. Complaint resolution times had dropped by 60%. Employee engagement scores were at their highest levels in the company's history. Even the financial analysts who had initially been skeptical about the costs of reform were now praising the results. Catherine looked at the numbers and felt a sense of satisfaction. Her moment of humiliation at an airport gate had led to changes that were helping thousands of people. Passengers were being treated better. Employees were working in healthier environments. A company was becoming more ethical and successful. She thought about Patricia Green and wondered if the former gate agent ever reflected on what she had lost. Patricia had probably thought Catherine was just another powerless passenger who could be dismissed without consequence. She had wielded her small amount of authority like a weapon, never considering that her actions might catch up with her. The same was true for Helen Price, who had built a career on intimidation and favoritism. She had thought her connections made her untouchable. She had been wrong. Power without accountability eventually collapsed, whether it was in a small airport or a large corporation. Daniel put his arm around Catherine and said he was grateful that she had told him about what happened. He said she had given him an opportunity to make a real difference. Catherine laughed and said she had just been venting about a bad day. He had been the one who decided to take action. They talked about what they might do next. Daniel's company was growing rapidly, and he had opportunities to partner with other organizations. Catherine suggested he look for situations where he could promote positive change. Daniel agreed, saying that financial success felt hollow unless it was accompanied by meaningful impact. Over the following months, the story of Skyway's transformation became known in business circles. Articles were written analyzing what had worked and why. Business schools developed case studies examining the process. Other companies reached out to Charles asking for advice on cultural reform. Charles credited Daniel's partnership and the tough accountability measures for driving change. Daniel credited Charles's willingness to face uncomfortable truths and make hard decisions. Both men recognized that real change required commitment from leadership and could not be faked or delegated. The incident that had started everything became a footnote in the larger story. Most people who flew Skyway Airlines never knew about Catherine's experience at Gate 47 or the firings that followed. They simply noticed that the airline seemed friendlier and more reliable than others. That was exactly how Catherine preferred it. She continued to fly regularly, always maintaining her modest appearance and kind demeanor. She treated flight attendants and gate agents with respect because that was who she was. Occasionally, someone would recognize her name when checking in, and she would see a flicker of awareness in their eyes. But no one ever made a big deal about it, and she appreciated that. Daniel's company continued to thrive. The partnership with Skyway led to other opportunities in the transportation industry. His reputation as someone who combined business success with ethical leadership opened doors and attracted talented people who wanted to work for a company with strong values. Years later, when Catherine looked back on that day at Dallas International Airport, she realized it had been a turning point. Not just for her or for Daniel, but for everyone connected to what happened. People had learned that actions have consequences. Organizations had learned that culture matters. Leaders had learned that accountability drives improvement. The gate agents who had been fired had learned the hardest lesson of all. They had discovered that treating others poorly eventually came back to haunt them.